and welcome back. Now, as teens navigate an unprecedented period of a prolonged global crisis, concerns arise on the impact this is having on their mental health. Well, this morning, we'll look at the current state of Kenyan youth and what concerns them the most at this time. In addition, what is so difficult about reaching this generation? And lastly, we'll give insights to parents of adolescents on how they can better understand and help them through this time. Let me introduce my guests very quickly. Dr. Kirinti Odindo, a positive psychologist who specializes in adolescent mental health, as well as Reverend Hamisi Kirenga, Executive Director at the Spread Truth Africa. He's also a youth pastor. And last but not least, we have Zaria Gikonyo, who will be sharing her lived experience. Thank you all for joining me this early morning. I wonder if any of you are a morning person or we're still trying to wake up at this point. Zaria, let me begin with you. You've been very, very open about your experience when it comes to mental health. And just the very kind of difficult period it was for you as a teenager. You're in university now, but if you were to kind of give us an assessment on what the typical young person, teen, Kenyan teen, is going through, you know, what kind of concerns them right now, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, especially with school. Obviously, people want to finish quick and be done with it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, we don't have that at the moment. There are many teens as well who are very depressed, but they don't know how to come out about it. And the depression leads to anxiety as well. So, and anxiety is so hard to deal with that some people opt to take drugs to try cope with that. I've also noticed that there are few people who are struggling with eating disorders, especially during the pandemic. You know, you're at home, you're eating, you're all that. You go back to school and people are like, oh, you've gained weight, or if you are sick, or you've lost a lot of weight. That's, believe it or not, that's not something you should say to people. Whether someone has lost weight or gained weight, that's their business, because you don't know what has led to this situation. So yeah, that's the biggest problem at the moment.
Interesting, you mentioned eating disorders, which we'll get to that, because it's not something that people would kind of pair to a mental stress or that manifesting in that way. But, you know, Reverend Kirenga, let me bring you in here. You do a lot of engagement with youth across the country. And so you've seen different scenarios that affect the youth. From what you've seen, what you've observed, and particularly in the last year, you know, what are youth dealing with now? What are their biggest concerns?
Thank you, Victoria, for having us this morning. Like you say, we are not used to waking up this early. But as Zara has talked about anxiety, there's a lot of anxiety with our teenagers in the country, all across the places we visited. You realize that there's uncertainty for tomorrow. Teenagers would like to be able to predict what will happen tomorrow. And they've already programmed their life. I finish grade 6, I go to grade 7. After that, there is a graduation. Then after the graduation, I do A, B, C, D. And right now with the pandemic, you can't really predict what will happen tomorrow. And as a result, it has created a lot of anxiety. And like Zara has talked about, eating dishabit and other form of engagement young people are getting themselves into, like drugs and the rest, is as a result of the general anxiety disorder that has been brought about by the pandemic. And that is what I've seen all across the country, that they cannot predict what will happen tomorrow. And the second thing that I've noted is because the pandemic has also restricted their social engagement. Young people are people who like to go out, have fun, especially teenagers who like to engage with their friends. And right now, with the isolation and with the social distancing, it has really, really killed the very fabric of who is a teenager.
It's interesting, and I'll bring Dr. Kirinti in on that, and Reverend Kirenga, you're so right. A lot of the things that would be markers for normal teenage life or just normal life have been completely taken out of the equation, right? So things that you would do, if it's socializing, if it's sports at school, if it's physically going to school, those things weren't happening for a good 8 months last year. Dr. Kirinti, when you look at that aspect, and how much of an impact that is on just the general not sociological, but psychological makeup of a teen, you know, what is the impact, what's the effect of that?
Good morning again, and I'll just make a small correction. I mean, the positive psychology is add-on, but generally I will be consulting psychologists on the more clinical and social level. I think what we're seeing, just like Zaria and Pastor Gringa have said, really anxiety is the bottom line. And what we do know is that extreme periods of stress or extreme periods of any heightened anxiety will shift your makeup. And I think most importantly, it does a shift on even your brain and the way your mind and brain attends to any kind of threat. So generally, I mean, think about the changes coming in the way we see reward, because we have reward centers in our brain, the way we memorize our information and what we're putting in at our memory and foundational stuff, but also just what we see as threat. So you can have threat for a prolonged period of time, and COVID-19 is a threat, but then you can normalize it. And the normalizing can be called resilience, which is good. But then you create this more, what we say, like a latent vulnerability. So the vulnerability might not even be seen in the now. The vulnerability might be seen in the later. So you have an adolescent today who'll be a young adult tomorrow, who'll be an older adult. So the change might be seen in the older adults as they go through another stressor. So you've got the ones who had a little more of an unstable space prior to COVID-19. Those will probably be the first to struggle the most. And then you've got the ones, well, maybe everything was going fine. And then you've got this long, prolonged period that you might not always adapt to well, or even if you think you're adapting, you're not necessarily trying to process in a way that you pack it in a nice, neat space, and then it pops up later. You know, it could be work, could be like life does, some other life difficulty. There could be also so much that's coming from our childhood that we're carrying through, that this period also allows to open up into a space. And then you've got all this sort of volcano eruption kind of thing, if I can make it a little more relatable.
Absolutely. You know, and Zaria, let me bring you in there on that point. Just for a parent watching and trying to understand, what is my teen going through now? You mentioned earlier on that they don't know how to express what it is that they're dealing with, especially if it's mental stress or psychological. You know, when you were in that phase of teenagehood and kind of dealing with a lot of the mental stress, mental disorder as well, which you'll kind of delve into a bit deeper, what was that period like? You know, if you're to explain it to a parent of, this is what I was feeling, this is why I couldn't talk to anyone, why I didn't feel I had a safe space. What was that like?
Well, when I first started experiencing my mental stress, no one was talking about mental health. There was a lot of stigma. I remember at around 13, I had palpitations. So they thought I had a heart condition. I was sent to a cardiologist, but he said it was anxiety. And I was so offended, my mom as well, that we stopped seeing him. So that stigma is what scared me into coming out. I was also young. I didn't understand what was going on. But what helped me is a lot of international shows. Many of the celebrities who have come out with having mental illnesses. So that really helped me a lot. And when I first told my mom about what I'm going through, I went to her as a joke so that it's not so tense. Because sometimes parents can make you feel so, I feel like the only way you'll be comfortable with your parent is if they create that space for you to go to them. If you feel comfortable to go to them, then definitely it'll be much easier. But even though my parents are accepting, it was still hard for me because of the stigma, and no one was talking about mental health. Yeah.
It's interesting how you mentioned media kind of broke down that stigma for you,
Yeah.
because you saw other, I guess, prominent individuals sharing their struggles, and so you realized, okay, so I'm not as abnormal as I thought I was.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a super important point, which, you know, Reverend Kirinti, I'll bring to you, and that is parents kind of creating that environment, right? That comfort for a teen to feel, I can come to you. And really, that should be how this scenario is. You know, from what you've seen, from what teens tell you when they're frustrated, do they generally have that safe space and comfort to approach their parents or not? And why is that not the case, if at all?
Thank you, because I think what Zaria has talked about, it's okay not to be okay. And we've stigmatized a lot mental health issues. And I think as parents, we should first and foremost treat mental health as any other normal illness. Because in our community, you notice that if someone has mental health issues, they are really stigmatized. And as a result of that, there's no safe space for them to be able to talk. And what I've encouraged teenagers and especially parents is to be able to create healthy relationship with their children. So that when they be able to have these issues, they can pick up. Last year, there was a video that was trending all over the country in regard to a parent who was able to actually notice first there's a change in their teenager, and this was an event that we've organized as an organization, because one of the things we do, which I'll probably get on later on, is we've had events where young people can be able to express themselves and talk about these issues openly, because we've stigmatized a lot health issues, and as a result of that, there's no that safe space. And as an organization, we've really pushed with the National Youth Council to be able to let parents know, number one, that mental health is just like any other sickness. It's okay not to be okay. But number two, it is important for parents to be able to create relationships with their children. We live in a world right now that is very demanding, and especially with the pandemic. And what we've noted when we go to the informal settlements is that there's a lot of loss of employment, and there's a lot of stress that parents are going through. And as a result of that, many of them go home. They don't have meaningful conversation with their children. And therefore, we've really pushed all across the country in our program called Kikao for parents to be able to come with their children to know how do we be able to talk to and have meaningful conversation with our children. And therefore, I believe it is important for parents first to understand that mental illness is just like any other disease. When you have a headache, Victoria, you go to see a doctor. What about when you have mental illnesses issues? What do we do? And that is why even a task force was formed by the president 2 years ago that went across the country. And they were able to collect data and show that 1 out of 10 people in the country are going through mental issues. And as a result of that, they actually say to the president, we need to declare mental health a problem in the country. And you've seen that what Zaria was talking about, that even celebrities are coming out right now. Before that, people will not talk about it. People will hide their children who have mental health issues. If children go through depression, they'll be isolated. And that is why you see during this pandemic, because of isolation, it has increased. Because we are not able to talk to each other, we're not able to converse with each other. And as a result of that, mental health issues have gone on the rise. And that is why, as an organization, we formed a program called Kikao and Sawazisha Gumzo with the national government going around the country. And we've gone to 31 counties to be able to talk to the youth that it is okay not to be okay. And we tell the parents this mental illness is a normal issue, that we just need to see it from a different angle. As a result of that, then we can take measures that are appropriate.
Certainly, Dr. Kirinti, you know, as we were discussing this topic yesterday, you mentioned something very interesting, that parents really are a big problem, if not the biggest problem, when it comes to mental health and teens. You know, kind of unpack that a bit more in terms of what parents should be looking at when dealing with this issue.
I mean, let me just maybe cascade off Pastor Kirinti's point. I mean, you know, my relationship and my experience with young people is that a lot of young people are open to the idea of mental health because they live in a world where that media space that they interact with actually puts mental health in the forefront. So you have a lot of organizations that are run by youth. So you've got this younger adult group. Okay, so we're getting into our 20s and we have a little more autonomy, we have a little more control. Now, our biggest problem, or at least what I have seen as the biggest problem, is the more dependent young person. So the adolescent. When we're talking about the teen, whether the younger teen or anybody who has in some way a need to be under an adult. Because if the adult, because this is really what we don't realize, is that mental health concern that's popping up in the child has a bit of a mix between what is in the environment and what's within them. So if I can cope with my environment, there will be some sort of externalized impairment, or what I see as an inability to cope with my world. And it could be both about my efficacy and the way I put things together and how I see my capability to adapt. But it is also very much around the environment that the person finds themselves in. So there are ways to identify, and you do have parents who are able to notice, oh, I've seen a behavioral change. What am I seeing? This person is isolating, or they're getting a little more agitated, very aroused, they're all over the place, they don't seem to be settling very well, or I might see a change in their emotions. So this might very much look like disrupted emotions, so a lot of shifts between very high-end positive to very low-end, more negative, sad emotions. It could be more consistently maybe sad or angry, because it's easier to be angry than to be sad. So sometimes we see aggression or frustration, irritability, and we sort of say, oh, they're just having a bad day. But how prolonged, how continuous is that? Are they also in happy, which we think is a tick and a good thing, but is it on a happy that is not exactly within a moderated space? So they're very heightened in what looks like happiness to us, and they seem to be a little more jumpy. Are we seeing changes in maybe their regulation patterns, and that's where the food and the eating is coming in? Is it too much? Is it too little? Is the sleep too much, too little? Are we seeing very regular hours on aspects of that? But you've also got changes that you might look like issues of self-concept. What are they saying about themselves? What are they saying about others? How are they, what's the language they're using around what the world is? Are they sounding hopeless? Are they highly pessimistic or critical? Or are you hearing that they're looking forward to the future, even though there is a pandemic, for example? Are you hearing, but you see, to hear and to see these signs, you've got to be present. These are not things that you will always pick up, because young people know how to mask. They know how to put on a face. They can tell you what you want to know. And you're never going to know behind the surface or behind that mask what's going on, because at that stage, their peers are more important. And I can tell you, Victoria, so many parents have no idea what is going on socially with their kids. They might know there's a friend or two. They don't know what the conversations are. People don't come home. The pandemic has stopped that. And even before the pandemic, that socialization that was neighborhood is not so safe anymore. So you're getting people both informal settlements, but I will add to what Pastor Kirinti said, people with high walls, high gates, people who are invisible. So you have the resource, but you're invisible. And how do you then really create the kind of dynamic that allows a support system to come around?
And you know, Zaria, I wonder from where you sit, what does that look like in terms of a parent creating a conducive environment for their teen, for their child? You know, in the ideal situation, what should it look like?
I feel like even if you don't understand what the mental illness is, pretend you understand. You know, make us feel like you're trying to learn and understand. When your child is going for a doctor's appointment, try go with them. When they're given medication, try look up this medication and see what is it, what does it treat, what are the side effects I should look out for, because many of the antidepressants and mood stabilizers actually cause suicidal thoughts. So, and medication won't work immediately. My doctor always tells me, medication will do 10%, the rest is yours. So parents shouldn't see that, oh, she has medication, so she should be fine. You should follow up. Make sure she has someone else to talk to. If she's not comfortable talking to you, make sure he or she has someone else to talk to. Yeah, that's really important at the moment and going forward.
You mentioned how, okay, yes, medication is a remedy of sorts, but it only does a bit of the work and the rest really is you. So break that down. What does that look like in terms of the work you need to do and then the support that you need from people around you?
Yeah, first there's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And sometimes I feel like I should have started with that. I should have paid more attention to that. But at the time, there was so much stigma around, oh, you're going to see a therapist, or this and this. Because the first time I spoke to someone, I think I was 14. And people would ask me, where are you going? I'm like, oh, I'm just going to the doctor, you know, for a checkup. Because I couldn't, where do I even start? You know? So yeah, that's the hardest part. So CBT, and also just find small things that will help you cope. For instance, when I have anxiety, I figured out how to solve a Rubik's Cube, so that when I'm shaking or I want to distract myself, at least I can fidget or something instead of shaking and, you know, starting to panic. So that's one way I try cope sometimes. If my hands are not shaking too much, then I solve the cube. Yeah. And
what about, okay, I know you're more open now, but when it came to talking to your peers, your friends, about what it is that you were going through, because you said how you'd say, I'm going to the doctor. And that was just like a blanket statement, or rather tag for the therapist. But when it came to opening up to your peers and friends, what was that like?
I think by the time I got comfortable with it, I just said it. I didn't care. I just said it. I was like, but I usually break the news in a manner that is light and like I'm joking. So I'll either say, oh, by the way, my brain is malfunctioning or something, so that at least they can laugh and then we'll start talking about it. When I was diagnosed with bipolar, first I didn't even know what bipolar was. The doctor told me, I think we're dealing with bipolar. I was like, okay, because I was like, and?
Right.
Then I really started doing research about it. And my friends actually knew about bipolar. So they really helped me understand, and they were like, this is not the end. Yeah, it's just something that has come. You're more than this illness. So that's how I began to accept things. Friends are really important, and if your friends don't support you or if they mock you, leave them.
It's interesting, and you know, Pastor Kirenga, hearing Zaria talk about, okay, she was diagnosed with bipolar, she didn't know at the time what it was, but her friends knew, right? So we're in a day and age now where the stigma is lessening because we know more of what we're dealing with. How much of a difference do you think this is making, that, you know, you're dealing with a generation that is aware that, yes, mental health or mental disorders are a thing, and this is something that we're dealing with now? Does that help, you know, as we navigate?
It helps in a way because, Victoria, as you listened to Zaria talk about, she was able to seek help. And with the social media, with all these interactions from Instagram and the rest, the ability to talk to each other really has gone a long way in helping, because one of the issue about mental health is that it's an invisible enemy. You can't actually see and know someone is going through mental health issues unless they speak. And I feel that one of the advantages of the social media, it has created a safe space in a way that we can be able to talk, interact. Zaria can connect with a celebrity in the US who they don't know, and they can share their life from childhood and what they have gone through. if you look at the life of all these celebrities that are renowned, like Whitney Houston and the rest, sharing their story, coming out. The other day I was listening to Bobby Brown. He was coming out and talk about how his childhood affected him, later on it affected his children. And as a result of that, they were able to give mitigating measures. And therefore, we can say that social media has really opened that space, and young people can actually use social media to be able to help their cause right now with isolation. And you know, the pandemic has limited the interactions, and therefore we can actually Google, we can actually go to Facebook and be able to get information. And that's the beauty about the age we live in. The other day I was reading a research that was done by Baylor University in the US, and they were looking at 1918 during the Spanish flu, and they wondered how did teenagers cope then? And they're looking at how now can they be able to come up with solutions. But you discover then there was no social media. In fact, no one knew about the Spanish flu. We only got to know about it the other day. And therefore, we can actually use social media to be able to get solutions, because we have wonderful stories of people. Like I mentioned, last year we had a wonderful program in the informal settlement called Kikao, which is creating conversations, commonality, and community. Because we discover when young people start talking, you discover you're not the only one. When Zaria starts talking, right now I'm sure with Zaria's story it will go to different people, and they'll be able to understand this is a normal thing. And last year when we did that event, there's this lady who talked about the sun. And as a result of that, this video went all the way to Uganda and traded in Uganda. And there were people who were finding solution from the video, an event that we did in an informal settlement in Nairobi. And therefore, I can say that we can use social media to be able to learn about how do we overcome some of these issues related to mental health, but also learn from people who have come out and have actually been victorious. But Victoria, allow me to say this, that even as we talk about how she talked about seeking help, coming out, I think what I've seen, even as I've gone the country the last 2 years during this period, is that the closure of religious institutions has contributed heavily on issues of mental health. Like what Zaria talked about, seeking help. Most of these teenagers, because church is or the mosque has been a safe space for them to be able to talk, because as the parent was talking to Zaria and said, you know, you can go out and seek help. But here we are in this space whereby the places of social interaction, especially like what I mentioned, Baylor University talked about, religious institutions have played a big role in being able to stabilize our mental issues. And when we closed them for 2 years, we have seen a rise in the informal settlements and in all these places we visited. And mental issues have come out so strongly because there's no that interaction. You can't talk to your pastor. Like, I've been a pastor for 18 years. And I've dealt with so many issues. Young people come to my office and tell me, you know, I'm going through this. How do I get out? And we have the ability to work with them and mentor them. But when they were closed, where were young people going? Where are young people seeking help? Because majority of them will come to this religious institution. Therefore, I say, during this pandemic, we have closed that avenue. If you can only realize the importance of these spaces that Zaria is talking about, where they can seek help, we will be able to have a healthy nation.
You know, and you raise a very important point, how the restrictions literally held back a wave, or as Dr. Frank Njenga put it, an avalanche of mental stress that we are now kind of seeing being released during this time. And I'm seeing Engineer Lazaro Kanyambok, who's watching on Twitter, saying prolonged COVID-19 impact on us infiltrated heavy damage, or rather inflicted heavy damage on children's social life. That's the reason for increased cases of mental health amongst us. Dr. Kirinti, when you see or anticipate what we're going to be dealing with in the next year and moving forward, and especially specific to this generation, what are we likely to deal with when it comes to mental stress?
I think we're seeing it already in so many ways, because young people don't live in isolation of themselves. They are part of a system, a community, an ecosphere, if you will, that is made up of so many layers, and they just are part of the layers. So if you really look at, if it was a bed with mattresses, you know, stacked up, where do young people actually lie? So they might in population be a lot, but in terms of voice, representation, accessibility, of resource, they're just a small bit of the pie. So I would like to imagine that what we are now seeing is an indicator of what will be enhanced. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of high-level aggression, fatalities, ways in which people are using for coping and self-soothing that it's very, very impairing to society, it's dysfunctional. So, you know, we can go to all that we know already, and evidence is on the ground on what people do in a more negative way. Is it going to be the drugs? Is it going to be the violence that you see? Is it going to be heightened level of mental illness? And we want to call it mental illness as opposed to, you know, mental health is the wellness. So what is going to sit on that continuum? And what are we going to be seeing within workspaces? Because there are a lot more young adults as well within the workspace. If we're stretching it to the 24-25 year, which is the UN category high point. In terms of even just, I mean, Pastor Kirinti talks about people gravitating, of course, towards church. But in the honest truth, a lot of youth that I work with, and even where I go within a setup I put together for Peace Together initiative, is that a lot of people are losing faith in religious institutions. The ones that I see that are not losing as much faith and are still plugged in will be, in my mind and my experience, are the Muslims. But within the Christian faith, a lot of young people don't even want to begin to plug themselves in. And this is a place where I think the church needs to come and sit and look at itself and say, we exist, we are where we are, but are we going out in outreach? Are we going out in modeling to see? So I think we're going to see a lot more distancing, even though we are dealing with a lot more fatalities and therefore our existence is being questioned. But I think in that existence, there's also a lot of people who are going to be partnering, pairing. I can imagine what that baby boom is going to look like, and I wonder whether the government's ready in place to see what is going to be put in place, because all of this is going to be an upsurge, and it's going to be a stressor on a lot of very, very strained resources. We have it already. So I think whatever we've seen within the vice space, particularly within the mental illness space, will only be augmented. However, there are stories of a lot of resilience. It's whether that resilience is sitting well managed, well packed, and will not pop up. We're going into an election year. So what does that mean then for how people externalize their emotions, where there's been huge restraint, where there's been an inability to put your voice out there and get heard and get seen? Because again, like Zaria was saying, parents need to be able to be present to the need, but what if they too have come from a very complex trauma space, which is often the case? There's a lot of adverse childhood events that are going on. And these may not be seen as dramatic one-on-one single incident issues, but these are prolonged chronic stresses that really impact the way we present ourselves later in life, whether to our children or to any other person around us.
Certainly. And, you know, Pastor Kirinti, I have to bring you on a point that Dr. Kirinti raised, which is next year is going to be an election year. In fact, we are already in election mode. Let's just be honest with ourselves. And we know what happens when youth are engaged in that whole process. You know, how do you, and I know you also kind of interact with the political space in this country as well. What should happen in that space, and how can youth be effectively engaged and not used? Because, you know, they are abused in this process and then discarded after someone is elected. But how can we ensure that youth also are very aware of how their energies, how their passions are used during this time? And as Dr. Kirinti had mentioned, they're in a very fragile place, you know, after the pandemic. What should be done, and also from your perspective as a church?
I think with an election year coming, one of the biggest headaches, even within government, is the unemployment rate with the young people. Vicky, I've gone to so many places in this country. I've seen young people staying idle the whole day, and that is a time bomb. And therefore, as an institution, especially dealing with the young people, we try to use sports and we've really had a lot of success when it comes to sports, to be able to engage young people. And we normally, in our sports event, we normally also pass values in a way that they can be able to see that it's not only just a game that we are playing, but also we are trying to have what we call spiritual formation and character formation. And we've gone around the country with the National Youth Council, which is a government semi-autonomous body, and we've tried to engage youth as much as possible, but also exposing them to the government opportunity. Most of the young people in this country don't know about the affirmative funds that the government is providing to the young people to be able to start businesses. Because the one way we can actually keep our young people off election violence is by keeping them busy. Because there's a saying that goes, don't tempt the devil by being idle. Because an idle mind is a devil's workshop. And we've tried as much as possible with the little resources that we have as an organization. But when we combine with the different organizations, we've seen a lot of success. There are success stories in the villages of young people starting businesses, getting engaged. In that way, then we keep them off from being idle and misused by politicians. And I must say this confidently, because I've been involved very closely, that there is a lot of success with the funds that are available to the different groups among the youth. In fact, there is a fund called Bell and Abiz that has actually reached out to thousands of young people in this country to be able to start businesses. And I feel strongly that as we go forward, that as an institution, especially now that Dr. has talked about what is the church doing, especially with outreach. And for us as an organization, one of the things we discovered why young people are actually also engaged in crime, engaged in activity, is because of a basic need called food. And we've given over 500 tons in this Republic of Kenya in the informal settlements. We've supplied food during this pandemic because most of these children, their parents are employed and they don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. And as a result of that, we've seen many of these young people involved in crime and getting used, as you talk about, by politicians. And as an institution, we've been providing food with so many groups in this Republic of Kenya to keep them off from crime, because we know when you have an empty stomach, Victoria, you're not going to sleep, you're going to do something. And as a result of that, we've taken these mitigating measures, and we've seen a lot of success. Because once your basic needs are taken care of, so what is next? And that is why we have a program called Kikao, which now we bring government in that program to be able to talk about the funds that are available. And we've seen so many different youth groups starting businesses and being able to get off crime and being able to not be used by politicians. And I will say there's a lot of success and there's a lot of hope. Like yesterday's prayer breakfast, the whole idea was about hope. There's a lot of hope for tomorrow. And we can look at next year with a lot of hope, knowing that even as you look at the government, what they have been putting in place measures to be able to see that next year there is no election violence and there is no misuse of young people as far as election is concerned. And there's a lot of hope in that regard with the programs that we are doing across the country.
You know, Dr. Kirinti, I have to bring you in. We're about to take a short break, but something that Pastor Kirenga mentioned, and it seems so basic, and it's something that is a human need, and that's the need to feed oneself, right? Causing a lot of mental stress, especially for youth who are in what we consider mashinani, right? And it becomes a class issue in terms of what are the biggest triggers or drivers for mental stress for youth who are in that cadre of society. You know, when we're addressing that, and I speak to a lot of people, youth workers who work in that space, and they tell me sometimes it comes down to just something like that, or not having a job or something to do to engage your mind, as Pastor Kirenga was saying. How do we engage those youth? Because sometimes it may not be a phone or a device or social media. It's something as basic as food. You know, how do we begin to deal with that as a trigger and a driver of the mental stress that we're seeing among youth today?
No, thank you, Victoria. I mean, Victoria, there's nothing that is new about human needs. Huh? Human need has been human need right from the start of time. Wars have been fought from our Bible, from our religious spaces, based on resource, whatever that resource is seen to be. So it's not like this is a new issue. And you know I work in the peace and security sector as well. And I think one of the biggest issues here is not the young people. It's the adults in the room. So you're really, you know, we're talking to the wrong people. And Pastor Kiringa, and I really want to honor your efforts. and what you're doing. But the singular way in which things are done will never solve what is a sociological pandemic in this country. And we know this, that these perpetuations are from the political space. And we know right from colonialism what the tactics were to get people on board. So a lot of the kind of space that exists and the reason why so much of this, it's not that we don't have the experts, it's not that we don't have the blueprints, it's not that we don't have wonderfully written documentation. Our problem is implementation and sustainability. And this is where policy comes in. We could sit here and talk all day till the cows come home. It will not change until the people who will decide to make the change really buy into the change. But you've got to remember, these people have also gone through their own trauma. So what we do see in the way politics is done is from people who've gone through exactly what we're talking about today. So it is a wider conversation that has to be tiered, that has to be multidimensional, that has to be integrated if we're going to do anything. Because we don't need peace, but neither is just feeding someone going to solve the longer standing issues that come up when deeper identity and other much more psychological spaces are triggered emotionally when we get into that season.
Oh, great point to take a short break here on Daybreak. A lot needs to be done from various quarters when we start talking about addressing not just the psychological, but as Dr. Kirinti said, sociological challenges that we're going through as a society. We're taking a short break. The conversation on mental health in teens continues. Stay with us and keep tweeting as well. We'll try to get some of your reactions on the other side of this break. All right, welcome back. You're watching Daybreak. Our conversation on mental health in teens still continues. We were having a very interesting discussion during the break, and this is, I guess, when it always happens. It comes alive during the commercial breaks. But let me bring Zaria in on a particular point that we were just discussing with Pastor Kiringa, and that's how parents can identify or notice. And Zaria, in your particular case, it was more you who came to your mother and said, I'm not okay. You know, kind of describe that situation, that scenario, because it educates parents as well into seeing what's happening with their child.
Yeah. I remember that day I was taking a shower and I looked up and I was like, if I decide to hang from this shower head, can it hold me? That's when I was like, no, this is not normal. So I went to my mom, I told her, yeah, there's a problem and I need help. So me and my mom, I've always been comfortable telling her things, so that wasn't an issue. So that's when the next day we went to see a doctor. This doctor has seen almost every member of my family, so he knows us. And since then, I'm so grateful because my life changed. I'm so glad that I have such a doctor that walks with me, wants to listen to me. When I'm having a hypomanic episode and I'm just saying random things, he'll listen. Sometime there was a time I called him and just asked him, where are you? And how are you? Because I was having a hypomanic episode. So I was just like, where are you? Then he told me, I was like, okay, that's all. So having a doctor like that, and especially because this medication, it's so hard to get the right combination. And with other doctors, when I tell them I'm having this and this side effect, they don't believe me. But what I came to understand is that not everyone's body is the same. So if I say I'm having this side effect, please believe me, because I don't want to feel like I'm making things up. And that's when I was sick and I had nerve damage. I remember I went to see the late Professor Kioi, and he's the first person who said that this could be a mental health issue. And I took offense, because I was like, he's invalidating my pain, and he's saying that I'm faking. But that's not what he was saying, but that's what I came out with. So, but if I had followed what he told me, maybe I wouldn't be where I am today, but I'm grateful for where I am today, believe it or not. So, yeah, that's basically it. And I'm 22 now, but my mom will not let me go for a doctor's appointment alone. I tell her, I'm like, I'm okay. She's like, no, I'm coming. And she asks questions before I take medicine. She's doing research. And I'm like, if you do so much research, you won't take the medication. So she's doing research. She's had so many sleepless nights. And I feel bad because sometimes I get drug-induced psychosis. So she's always checking on me. Sometimes she thinks I'm calling her. So it's just a lot. Yeah, but my parents have been really supportive, and I'm grateful for that. It's always, when I'm talking about it, it's always light.
Yeah.
So it's always like a joke. Like yesterday, I was telling my dad about how I was diagnosed with the eating disorder. So I was like, every day I feel like I'm coming home with a new mental illness. So we were just joking like that, and that's what makes me comfortable with them. So I'm able to tell them whatever. If I'm feeling down, I tell them. Even when they are feeling down, they tell me. And we laugh about it sometimes, we joke. Other times it's serious. I'm like, if my mom or dad is feeling bad, I'm like, how would you like me to help? I tell them what my coping mechanisms to see if it can help. I ask them if they want me to take them to the doctor. Sometimes I joke with them. I'm like, do you want me to take you to the mental institute I was at? So it's just things like that. But if my parents didn't accept and if they didn't support me, I don't think I would be here today.
You know, it's interesting, Zaria, because I've been familiar with your story for the last, I guess, 3 years now. And just seeing the progression and how compassion really has kind of become a foundation of the relationship between you and your parents. And you've learned more about each other in the process, right? At least from what I'm hearing. And Dr. Kirinti, let me bring you in there, because it's a journey, it's a process to get to that point where child and parent can understand each other. You know, you mentioned how a parent can be going through their own trauma, their own issues, and to even begin to start to think about being a support and a help to their child is a whole nother challenge and a whole nother set of challenges that comes in. But how do they begin that process and that journey to understanding and supporting?
I mean, let me start by celebrating Zaria's parents, because, to be honest, that's actually not the norm, particularly when she put stigma in the space. And I think a lot of this needs that wider space. So Victoria, you know, when it's just the power of one or the power of two, because many of our homes are not a two-parent home like Zaria's. For whatever reason, they are just a primary caregiver with the children, or with a child, as the case may be. So who then circles that group of people? Because it does need the village. And what does our village look like in an urban area where you're more likely going to have a lot more stresses coming on the plate because of the demands that are set up, you know, upon us in an urban space? So who is around us? And that's where I guess Pastor Kiringa comes in when we look at what our faith-based organizations are for us, but where people then remove themselves. So there are more and more homes that don't go to any religious space. So then who's around them? Is it sometimes, and that happens often, is there will be an auntie or a family friend who points out to the parent in the home, I noticed this about your child, or this has gone on, or I heard about this, and I think I'll walk with you. So often enough, some of the young people don't even come in with their parents, but they come in with another trusted adult. Could be teachers. I got a call the other day from actually someone who had been struggling greatly 3 years ago. And I had really urged her to make sure her children are in a space where they can process. But 3 years later, it's the school that called her before coming into me and said, something's going on with your child. So really focusing on looking at trauma-informed ways in which we're working from our schools, from our homes, from our workplaces. There might be an HR. I've had HR call me about people's children. And they're the ones, because something happened or, you know, whatever manifestations for the adult was at the workplace. And when they sat together, it came out that it was a struggle. So we need these spaces bolstered in terms of the media really trying to disseminate information that is digestible, where we actually understand why stigma happens and how to break it. Because without that, there will be constant resistance. And really that is, the next person in the space might not always be your parent. But there needs to be society in that compassion that you're talking about, plugged in a very empathic way, so that what Zaria was saying is CBT are really ways in which we focus. I'm not saying there's no experts that are required in the room, but we need to go back to when there were no experts, who were at the top of that pinnacle of need. It wasn't down of the pyramid where that's the psychosocial basic needs that society can fill in. So how do we start educating people in their role for their neighbor? It's kindness, it's compassion, it's integrity, it's trust, it's respect, it's acceptance. All those value-based things Pastor Kiringa talks about that need to be the bedrock of a society that holds itself. But as we are constituted today and the kind of selfish capitalistic way that we're living, then this is not going to hold our spaces, and not the vulnerable people. And this is where children, adolescents, and the youth are. They're in very vulnerable space.
And let's talk about another group of people who are in that ecosystem, if you will, interacting with teens. And this is based on a question from Mbuka, who's watching us on Twitter. He asks, how can we help learners who are experiencing mental problems as teachers? And this is due to the pressure from parents to perform in school. This is not new. We're just coming out of an exam cycle, and we know the pressures that parents put upon their kids to do well. You know, Dr. Kirinti, what's your response to that? What can teachers do?
Yeah, I've had a long experience within the school systems because that was the easiest place to get young people in, you know, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think teachers, what we try to do is really try and train them on what they need to be looking at. So the same things we're asking of the adults called parents, teachers are the quote-unquote parents for most kids, because that's where they spend, you know, most of their time. And they need to then have that trauma-informed eye. What are they looking at? What changes? They're the closest person. What's that one word you can tell a kid coming in to space that allows them to know it's not just academic, that you come in as a whole person, and the whole person that you are in this classroom is meaningful to me as a teacher. However, teachers are also strained individuals. They're stressed out by their system. The system might not allow them room to also deal with their personal struggles. So this cascades on and on for as long as we don't have a fallback measure within our spaces that people can actually get the care that they need so that they can care for others. And you know, they always talk about put an oxygen mask on yourself. But how do you do that within your own financial stresses and your own personal stresses as a teacher? So we've got to take care of the teacher themselves as an individual so that they can take care of the next group. Because teachers know what to do. They've got the background, they've got the information, they don't need to be experts. They're already experts in child development. And all we need is to move the cases that really do need the quote-unquote expert psychologists or psychiatrists to the next level. But this is where you start doing a lot of capacity building within schools so that they can be the first in line. You know, people who take on and they become the responders, as you say, first responders within a space. So it's about training, capacity building, and moving this information into classrooms and into the workplaces, because those are places that struggle as well.
Certainly. I want to pivot a bit and Zaria, get your reaction, or rather response. Social media. It's an interesting tool where if you use it the right way, it can be a great help. And in your situation, you mentioned how, you know, you managed to gain some encouragement hearing the stories of people who've been through mental health and whatnot. But then it can also be a trigger. And we've seen what it means to this generation. It almost becomes your world. Mm-hmm. And it informs your view on the world around you, the people around you, and how to navigate and move through it. What role does social media play for the average young person today, in your opinion? And I know you use it and you'll talk about it how, but what role does it play now?
Oh, social media is everything at the moment. People get their confidence from social media. People get ideas from social media. Coming out with the eating disorder was scary because I had no one I've not had people in Africa talk about it, so I was so scared. And social media has this expectation, so you'll see people posting their photos and you'll be told what the ideal body looks like or how your face is meant to look. And so especially teens growing up from 13 upwards, that's tough for them to see, because they start thinking, what about those people who don't look like the models? Does that mean less than? My eating disorder, it's not that I saw, it came from social media. It just came from the outside world. People, and social media is nasty as well.
Oh, yeah.
Social media is nasty because people still make comments, and I'm like, okay, you can attack me all you want, but at least I'll help someone in the process. So attack me all you want, but as long as I help someone, then I'm fine. The eating disorder started last year, but I didn't tell anyone until this year, not even my doctor. Because first of all, I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was a mental illness, but it consumed my life. It took over. And what many people don't know is that the opiate receptors in your brain, when you throw up, they go off. So I got addicted to throwing up. Sometimes I would eat for the purpose of throwing up. So I would binge, throw up, get that euphoric feeling, then feel guilty afterwards. It became, around March, it became a daily thing. I would do it every day, sometimes multiple times a day, till it started affecting me. So I was getting acid reflux, I was always coughing, I was always clearing my throat, and I was losing weight, but I was gaining weight. And it's not the best way for you to lose weight, but my brain tells me that that's the best way. So when I eat and I say, and I purge, I've removed what I ate, so it doesn't matter. So yeah, at first no one believed me, or no one understood what it was. They were like, they thought it was a choice. They think you want to do it on purpose, and that's the heartbreaking part, because it's, I wouldn't want to throw up. It's not, it hurts. You know, sometimes it really hurts because you're forcing it out. So, and the guilt afterwards, you're like, oh wow. But because I was addicted to opioids as well because of my illness, that euphoric feeling I used to get when I was high on the pills, now I'm getting it after throwing up. So I'm like, oh wow, I can get it, but it's only for a few seconds. So yeah, I think especially eating disorders, this is something we need to talk about more, because people go around making comments, even in elevators. I was in the hospital one day, and I was going up the elevator, and there was this sign for, if you want to lose stomach fat, call this number or what and what. And then sometimes people are like, oh, you've lost so much weight, are you okay? Or, oh, you've gained so much weight, what have you been eating? Both are bad. You've lost so much weight, someone will be like, oh, do I look bad? Or sometimes they tell you, you've lost weight, you look nice. So you're like, oh, did I look bad before? Or you've gained so much weight. When sometimes I gain weight because of medication. Some medication makes you gain weight, but you can't start explaining to people that that's what it is. So when someone asks me or tells me, oh, you've gained weight, I'm like, you don't even know what to say. Like, okay. Then I go home and I'm just overthinking, and then I start binging and purging. Then I start restricting,
Right.
which means I eat like 1 meal a day. Like on Monday, I ate on Monday, Tuesday I didn't eat the whole day. And now when I decide to eat, my body is like, what is this foreign thing? So I feel like throwing up. And I always try to find an excuse to throw up. So that's part of my excuse. And mind you, that's the first meal I've eaten since the day before. So it's just a daily thing. I'm having a bad relationship with food right now. That's how I can term it. I'm scared of food, basically.
I mean, it's clear it's still something, and thank you for your candor, Zaria. It's clear it's still something that you are working through. And for a young person who's probably watching this and is maybe triggered, let me bring in Dr. Kirinti. Just in terms of how people, I mean, it plays out and manifests in Zaria's situation with food for now. But, you know, how else does mental stress or mental disorder kind of manifest among young people? What are you seeing as some of the common things that are being exhibited by young people now? Zaria just talked about an eating disorder, which you don't hear a lot about, especially in our culture. But what are you seeing, and how would you kind of advise a young person to navigate this period or a time like this?
I think we are seeing, and I'm sure the other people who tuned in mental health, there's a lot of self-regulation issues, which will then tie into anxiety, because the whole idea of anxiety is generally looking at an irrational way of trying to take control of a situation you have no control over. So eating disorders, of course, are not as common because in our culture, food might not have the same connotation. Unless, of course, you're in a space where body image is so big. And I herald this age where the fuller body figure is reveled, you know, and that's very different depending on, I suppose, which areas of operation you're in. But it is a very different age from when we grew up, and really the model space was a skinny space and there was a lot there. But first and foremost, the idea of eating disorders or any other self-harming and self-maladaptive coping in a self-regulation space is a means of getting some control and some predictability. There will be this neurobiological space where our reward centers in the brain get triggered, and therefore we get patterns around it. But I think one of the biggest ways to deal with this is what we call behavioral activation. What else can we put in place that can counter that behavior, that gives us a feeling? It might not hit the same reward center spot, and this is the difficulty of any kind of repetitive, addictive behavior, is that anything we have control to do might not give us the same effect. But we've got our exercising that, at least, even though can be addictive, is a much healthier addiction. We've got things that help bring your body back to center, whether you're looking at meditative practices, even within prayer, if you're religiously oriented and using that as a way to bring yourself to point. There's a lot more being spoken about, you know, the idea of mindfulness. But what is mindfulness? It's just staying centered on the now and what's around us and focusing in, whether just visually or using any of our senses into the now. There is a problem, though, if you're constantly mindful, because it means you don't deal with the underlying. And I think really reaching out for support, and this is where we have a problem, Victoria, because we look like we're many, we're not many. It's still unaffordable to a lot of people. But really trying to look at the domains of behavior, the domain of what am I doing with my thoughts. Even if I'm using my phone, can I go into a game? Yeah, I downloaded a game that just distracts me sometimes when I need to. And there'll be a moment where they say, bring your emotions out so you can see what they are. But you want to see what they are in a constructive fashion. So if you're going to choose to journal, you're not journal just to take out your emotion. You take it out and then come back and try and process what that means so that your tomorrow does not read the same way as yesterday. So the other kind of mind strategies, and Zaria talked about cognitive behavioral, is just one of very many ways in which healing and recovery can come. But really bringing back into whether am I able to stop my thoughts? When I allow my thoughts to come, do I have control of thoughts that are more positive to me at this moment? Can I plaster them? Because we're visual people. So we need to work in ways that I'm constantly around people who give me the feeling of what I want, because this is all self-concept, self-esteem, the way I see myself, the way I plug myself in. Am I comfortable being me? But that comes from attachment, which is a childhood thing. So can I come into reparenting? What did I miss out? What is it about my childhood that has brought me to be who I am? What is it about my biology? Medication is really expensive, and Zaria can tell you this. So it's unaffordable for a lot of people. What do we have out there that can replace it? And enter Pastor Kirinti and some of that kind of support that we need to help us bring meaning and a more meaning-centered way in which we can actually value our existence today for tomorrow and feel fearfully and wonderfully made. But that's a difficult concept when your social media is saying you don't quite hit the mark, and you were told you didn't quite hit the mark all of your childhood. So even as a 20-year-old, what does that mean to you today? So support groups as well. Right. And I think there are more and more support groups on social media that people can come into. And hopefully, my Twitter is at Mindset Peace. I'm very happy to lead people to a lot of good organizations that are there on the ground today that allow people to find unaffordable ways to get help for themselves.
Certainly, and Pastor Kirinti, let me bring you in here because Dr. Kirinti talked about the alternatives to, if someone can't afford medication, for instance, if they can't afford a therapy session. And then on the flip side of that, you have places like Mathare, which people feel there's already a stigma attached to that. I don't want to go there for treatment. So, what other alternatives, and you represent that, do people have? And I want to tie that into a particular group that I know you deal with, and Maina Ndakalu raises it on Twitter. He says, there's someone I know, a second-year student, who's so depressed that he actually believed the world was coming to an end. He even went missing for days before we tracked him. Mental health in universities should be addressed. So that's another group now. We've been talking about teens who usually are under at least the care of parents or some guardian. But now you are in that gateway to adulthood proper, where you're minding yourself. How do you deal and reach out to university students who oftentimes really just have themselves or maybe their peers in terms of support?
Okay, I would say like what Dr. Kirinti was talking about, that meditation plays a big role, but he also talks about the religious institutions, because if you go to all the universities, there's what they call like Christian unions. If you go to the slums, like Zaria was talking about, she was able to seek help from a doctor, the parents were able to take, but majority of the youth in the country don't have that capacity, don't have that ability. So what do? And that is why I mentioned in my earlier conversation that churches play a big role, especially in the informal settlements. I've witnessed it myself, whereby the young people can find an avenue to be able to talk about what is going on. The youth pastors, the youth mentors in the villages, and when these institutions were closed, that was closed. And that is why I keep referring this, because a study was already done by, I mentioned, Baylor University. It shows that religious institutions play a huge role. They were able to interview 1,500 young people in the university, and they were able to find out of the 1,500 young people they interviewed, 80% of them said that they found a lot of stability in their mental health when they actually pray and connect with God, and when they go to religious institution. And therefore, we cannot run away from that fact that if we divorce ourselves from God and from religious institution, we'll find that there's a lot of instability when it comes to mental health. Because as a human being, be it in the university, be it a teenager, you are multidimensional. there is the spiritual aspect of you. If you don't feed it and take care of you, you know, we always talk about, even when Zaria was talking about the body, there's all these things talked about as far as your body is concerned. There's always these things talked about your soul is concerned. But what about your spiritual formation, which plays a huge role? Because the good book says, as a man thinketh, so is he. And that is why we say, even as an organization, that we want to take the young people back to God, because we believe that God is at the center. If you take God away from the institutions, like what happened in the US, they even did the same research I'm talking about. They realized that when they took God away from this institution, suicide cases increased and a lot of mental issues increased. And that is why we as an organization, we talk to the young people in the grassroots and encourage them to go back to church. Because Dr. Kirinti talked about that they're losing faith in the church, which is true. But we know that you cannot actually do away with your spiritual aspect of your life. If you do away with it, that is why we find that there's a rise in mental cases. And so therefore, we go back to the universities. We've gone to several universities. We've gone to several institutions. And even this weekend, Victoria, we're going to one institution, what we call the Inland Christian Church institution that is in Kajiado. And we're talking to young girls with the National Youth Council. And we're talking to them about the importance of God, number one, but also the importance of you talking about these issues, airing them out through a program called Kikao. And therefore, even as we look at the institutions from the university to the primary school, you find that they always have these religious meetings where young people can get in and be able to worship God. And in the process, they find that they have stability within themselves. We cannot run away from that fact, that if we get away from God, there's always that instability that is connected to it. And that is why a research was done and proved to be right, that this generation, because we are running away from God, we are running away from religious institutions, there is a rise in a lot of instability. And we are saying, don't look and criticize the church. Like what Dr. Kirinti is saying, there's a lot of hopelessness that is coming from religious institutions because of the religious leaders, but not because of what the religious institution is propagating. And we need to divorce the two. And that is why we are saying to the young people, even as an institution, that there is hope when you have God in you. And that is why, in as much as you cannot predict tomorrow with the uncertainty that is coming from this pandemic, when you find your place in God, there's a lot of rest in it. And that is why a famous scholar said, you'll be restless until you find rest in God. And that is why we are pushing that agenda, even in the universities, in the lower institutions, telling them that there is an important aspect of your life that you cannot run away, and that is the spiritual aspect of your life. And that is why we were pushing that agenda, to see that young people are going back to God and having a meaningful relationship, like Dr. Kirinti has talked about, because that helps in mental wellness as an overall factor.
Indeed. And, you know, I want to finish with...
I chime in a little bit there. I'm really sorry to interrupt, Victoria, but I just want to add in a point, and I think this is important. I mean, I am very, very plugged in from a religious aspect, but I think from a more wider understanding, I think what I can add on is to also really harp on the point that spirituality and religion are not the same thing. That religion is religion and man-made, and it's got its set of dogmas and rules and doctrine-led. And then you've got spirituality, which we all have. We have a birthright to the spiritual center in who we are, and we can fulfill that spiritual center in many ways. Of course, from a religious perspective, they use whichever books and doctrines they have. And I think just to remind people, because my feeling of how I'm connected then leads me to a higher being, a higher calling, and I will call that thing different. I mean, there are people who are environmentalists, who are atheists, who do good things. So you can be so spiritual and not be religious, and then you can be so religious and not spiritual. It's when those two are aligned that we're getting the value-based space that we need to bring cohesion and coherence into a space.
So religion and spirituality needs to kind of be separated, and you're putting spirituality above that, in your opinion?
Because that religion is a way to get into that heightened space of spirituality, whether you're Buddhist, Islam, Christian, Hindu, we're all leading into our spiritual center. Now, yes, I can imagine, Pastor, you might, argue from a Christian perspective, and it's very difficult when you stand where we are, not necessarily in that mental health space, to allow people to source spirituality. So what I tell people is, you've got to believe in something. You can't sit believing in nothing, because that's where the problem comes. When I believe in nothing, I'll fill it with something. And that something might not be some, allowing me to flourish in interconnectedness with the next person. So understanding how our religion leads us to spirituality is the key.
All right, believing in something and preferably a higher power. Zaria, let me finish with you because this conversation really comes back to the youth and young people. You talked about a very difficult season that you're still going through, that you're still navigating through, but I want to kind of end on a positive note on what gives you hope. You're still here, right? You had every other reason to finish it all and end it all, but you chose to still wake up, still continue with life. What keeps you going, and what kind of encouragement would you give to your peers right now to continue along the journey, even if it's still difficult and you're still trying to handle challenges along the way?
Well, there's still so much I want to accomplish. So when I can't get out of bed, or when I tell myself I'm not going to do this, then what I want to accomplish won't come true. So that's what gets me out of bed. Sometimes I won't lie and say that I'm always okay and I get out of bed and I'm excited. No. So I want to accomplish so many things, and if my mental health is not right, then I won't be able to accomplish them, because my mental health, when my mental health is bad, it affects me physically. And so I get nerve damage, and that just restricts me. I stay in the house, and that's another factor contributing to depression. That's how I got into drug addiction, because of the prescription medication. And many people don't know that prescription medication can be addictive. Because when I got addicted, I was young, and I thought there's no way a doctor can give me something that would basically ruin my life. I would hope the doctor would give me more information about it. Even pharmacies fed my addiction, because I went with a prescription maybe once or twice for opioids. After that, nothing. I would go and they're like, the usual. I'm like, yeah. Then sometimes I wasn't even going for that. They're like, do you have this and this? I'm like, no. And so that fed my addiction. And I would go to only 2 specific pharmacies because they knew me. And these are legal drugs, so it's not hard for me to get. But, and every day for me is recovery. I say I'm a recovering addict because, hypothetically, if you put the drugs that I was addicted to in front of me, I would take them. I'm not going to lie and say, oh, I'll do this, and no. I would take them, because at that time, that's how I coped. I was okay with coping like that, and I was comfortable. But when the drugs were taken away, I was forced to cope, like address my feelings,
right,
instead of masking them with the drugs. And the other thing I'm hopeful for is that I literally wake up every morning, and I want to raise awareness on mental health so bad. When people interact with me, it gives me, I get so happy. So no matter what I'm going through, if someone messages me, I will respond. And when people tell me, oh, you helped me talk to my parents, or you helped me get through today, that's all I want to accomplish in my life, besides getting my degree.
Yeah.
That's all I want to accomplish. And this year, I've just been looking at life different. I never used to believe in manifestation, but I started manifesting and speaking things into existence. I stopped praying. I felt like I was angry with God because I was like, why am I getting all these things thrown at me? I'm exhausted. But this year I started praying, and I feel different when I pray now because I actually mean it. And now because I'm so hopeful, and I just say I take every day as it comes. And there's a quote I had that I'm going to live by. It says, learn to let yourself rest, sleep and love in this life instead of waiting for death to set you free. That speaks for itself.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so that's what I would tell people. Just take it each one day at a time, because you can't plan for tomorrow. As we've seen, because of the pandemic, we literally can't plan for the future. So just take it one day at a time and seek help from wherever you feel comfortable. It doesn't have to be medical, but if you feel you can talk to your friends, then talk to them. If you're a stranger and you want to talk to me, I will respond. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zaria, and a great place to leave it. It's good to see that you are taking steps, positive steps, to a more hopeful future. And I guess that's, you know, the note to leave it at. Just have hope for tomorrow, a day at a time. As Zaria said, the pandemic has shown disruptions can happen. Life happens. But if you have the anchor of faith, according to Pastor Kirenga, that's also what keeps you steady when life is thrown at you. Thank you so much for watching Daybreak. Thank you to Dr. Kirinti as well for her insights. Zaria for coming on, for your candor and your honesty. Pastor Kirenga for your direction and helping us see things through a perspective of faith, which at the end of the day is what prevails. Thank you for watching. We leave you now with some music from the DJ. In the next hour, of course, much more on the day's news coming in our subsequent bulletins. Have a lovely Friday and a wonderful weekend ahead. Bye for now.
Vicky Bandes.